I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing Iran and the region in which it sits. With a new president in place, will Iran's proactive stance over the last few years intensify? Or will they succumb to the demands of the Joe Biden administration that, amongst other things, they must draw in their horns in the region? Normalization with the United States is, of course, out of the question. But a return to the status quo ante-Trump might be possible. The US might re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Although Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, did place as a condition of America rejoining the pact, which I remind you was once working rather well, is that Iran be far less expansive in its region. I am just an enthusiastic amateur in these affairs. I'm joined by an expert audience this evening. First up of whom is my good friend Isa Ali, formerly a political analyst, indeed still a political analyst, but mainly known now as one of the real up-and-coming television journalists working, as I do myself, for RT. Isa, it's the earnest hope that Iran will shorten its range in the region, that it will concentrate on its own internal affairs. The British government wants that, the Europeans want that, the new presidency in the United States wants that. But of course, the election of a new president in Iran has elected someone who, on the face of it, doesn't seem likely to grant them their wishes. How does it look to you?
Well, I think it's important to understand that when people talk about Iran's regional so-called ambitions or Iran's regional strategy, it is actually a strategy aimed at securing, let's say, the realm, securing the homeland, making the country more safe. Because the way the Iranian calculus is that first it's a moral question, supporting the resistance in Palestine, in Yemen, in Syria. All of these countries is first and foremost from their perspective, it's a moral perspective, but it also makes Iran safer. It gives them a strategic depth. And for as long as Iran feels threatened by the West, by Israel, by the Americans, by the British, by the French, by all of these countries, and now more so the Khaliji countries, the Persian Gulf countries, they will always have this calculus that we have to stay involved in the region. And the only way, if it's really the sincere intention of these countries, which some would say there is no sincerity between them, would be for them to remove all the sanctions, remove their warships from the Gulf, make Iran feel like it's not under threat. Until that point, which probably will never come, Iran will always make sure they have a presence, they're supporting these countries, they're supporting groups in these countries who, at the end of the day, will, like I said, be their strategic depth. Because we saw, with the after the murder of Haj Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes, it was probably the recognition on the American part that Iran could really strike America anywhere at any time. That de-escalated the situation, actually. So I think the election of President Raisi is probably a recognition on that front by Iran that maybe their previous response was, especially to those killings, was incoherent somewhat because you have different factions in Iran. And the way I look at it, just from an outsider looking in, that the country's approach going forward now to regional affairs will be more united, will be more coherent, and might actually then help them to, address the issues domestically inside Iran as well, of which, of course, there are many.
We'll come to those. It's a kind of truism that the moderates who have been in control of the presidency for this last period have somehow been found wanting. But if you looked objectively at Iran's reach in the region, its power in the region, let's call it what it is, its power in Iraq, its power in Yemen, its power in Syria, its power in Lebanon, they haven't done too badly, have they?
No, absolutely. And, you know, this is a country which has obviously been under so much pressure, sanctions and boycotts and all these other embargoes that the West have tried to place on Iran. And yet the Houthis are, you know, giving the Saudis the hiding of their life. In Lebanon, Hezbollah still remain extremely strong, and the kind of axis around which security depends in that country. So the Iranian response, I think, and their calculus and the way, you know, the decision to perhaps make it easier for President Raisi to become president, I would say, is based around the fact that, for example, in the wake of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and you can speak to some of the commanders of some of the Iraqi resistance groups as well, who felt like they had the handcuffs put on them in their response to that because of the political calculations within Iran. And again, it was kind of not coherent. There were some saying, no, don't respond, do respond. I think now what you're going to see is a more rounded approach, a more coherent response. And I think Raisi has another responsibility as well internally, which is the question of the sanctions, question of corruption, which always comes up as a consequence of sanctions. And I think he has the approval of the hierarchy, the leadership of Sayyid Ali Khamenei to really tackle those issues as well, which I think will make Iran stronger in the region.
Would those be some of the reasons why the turnout in the presidential election was so low?
Yeah, I would say so. I think there's a sense amongst some Iranians that, and look, I think it's always important to differentiate between Iranians who might be annoyed at the government at the time and who are annoyed at the entire system. We saw after the killing of Haj Qasem, even if people have a problem with this politician or that politician, when it comes to the crunch, Iranians are united. And if it's a question of, you know, anarchy and chaos and the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, they will always side with the government. And we saw the tens of millions coming out to mourn his death. But at the same time, there were those who have real serious misgivings about the situation. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge to Raisi, which is that you have to get these people back on side, because there is corruption there. There is corruption amongst people who, there are people who are supporters of the system who are upset by this as well. You know, let's leave aside kind of the people working for the West or whoever they might be working for groups like the MEK. There are people who are sincere and upset at the situation. And I think, again, that for me would be Raisi's biggest challenge, is getting them on side once more.
Patrick O'Regan, journalist, author. You write on foreign policy on the Focus website. You're a former editor of the Newsline, a long-standing anti-imperialist. Do you stand four square behind the new Iranian government?
Yes, of course. Against imperialism, we support them all the way. I think Iran has got a tremendous role to play in the crisis that's emerging. And I just want to say a few words about this crisis. That today is the 10th day, the last day of a US 6th Fleet exercise in the Black Sea, right along Russia's territory. It's been there for 10 days. And there are 32 states involved in it, 5,000 soldiers, and the following states are also involved: Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and the UAE. These are all Arab states, and they're all involved in this anti-Russian venture. And Hamas has made a comment about it. It said that we condemn the participation of Arab and Muslim countries in military maneuvers with the Zionist regime. It continued that we call upon the Arab states to immediately withdraw from the event and boycott any joint civil and military activities with the Zionist regime. And it added, it's looking forward to seeing Muslim nations mobilize their forces and participate in military exercises in defense of the Palestinian nation against oppression and in preparation for the great battle to liberate Palestine. And I support that position. And I think that Iran has got a huge role to play in the situation, because in Palestine at the moment, you have a situation where the screws are being turned on the poorest people. The Zionist regime is dumping people out of their homes, telling them they have no right to be on the property they've lived on and their forefathers have lived on, getting rid of them and telling them that if they don't go, they'll be jailed, and saying that they have to, if they don't want to pay 60,000 to transfer somewhere else, they've got to demolish their own home. And that sort of is a huge tension building up. You know, the 11-day war of a month or so ago is now giving way to a tremendous internal struggle in the occupied territories in Palestine. And I think that at some stage or other, the Arab states, including Iran, have got to say that if the Palestinian people are driven into an uprising, then they will stand by it and intervene. Otherwise, we're going to have a gigantic massacre. And I think that's the situation that we're in. So I think that Iran has got a huge role to play in this, and that this kind of the kind of situation we've got now, where there is a world capitalist crisis, where they're talking about a huge crash ahead because of all the inflationary spending that's been taking place. America is looking after itself and is going to stop at nothing to do what it needs to survive. And I think it's in this cutthroat world that Iran, for example...
It doesn't trouble you that the news line could not be published in Iran, that a socialist would have no political space in Iran? It doesn't trouble you that the Iranian system is explicitly an Islamist system? That doesn't trouble you?
It does, but it's not the decisive question. The decisive question is the role that Iran plays in the anti-imperialist struggle, and it plays a massive role in the anti-imperialist struggle. And it could well play a huge role in Palestine, in what's about to take place. For example, they're going to have to decide now whether they're going to try and get along with the imperialist powers or not, so to speak. That they have the question of nuclear power, giving up their nuclear research in order to get back some trading agreements with the Western powers. Well, I think that, in my humble opinion, that to do that would be suicide, and that they should stick with their nuclear weaponry and to develop it.
Well, they don't have nuclear weaponry, but
they're on the way.
You think they should continue on that path?
I think so.
Maybe we'll come back to that. Now, speaking of Palestine, Robert in Lakesh is a very brave journalist who has reported from the occupied territories, been in some hairy situations. Robert, glad you're here in one piece, because not all journalists manage that, of course, in the region. Patrick mentioned Hamas there. And in an extraordinary shift, it would seem, Hamas are back on Saudi TV, on Al Arabi television. The political head of Hamas gave an interview. He said that he wished that Hamas could get back to their former relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. To be fair, he also thanked Iran on Saudi TV for their weapons and support. How is all this playing in the Palestinian arena, do you think? Do they have a view on the political changes in Iran? Are they hoping for more from Iran or less involvement from Iran?
Well, of course, the Palestinian organizations, including this is the PFLP as well, the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, which participated in Saif al-Quds, or the name that's given for the military operation by the Palestinian Joint Rim of Resistance back a few months ago now, and what's otherwise known as the 11-Day War, they all get support from Iran. So that includes, of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. But what we're seeing now, and you mentioned something very key, is that because of that, really what was a military victory, or if you're talking about guerrilla warfare, it was a victory for the Palestinian resistance in that case. That being helped on by Iran has now set an example for other countries in the region that they should perhaps change their tactics. And so, for instance, Qatar as well took note to what happened there. And then on top of that as well, with this shift in Saudi Arabia is obviously sort of at loggerheads at the moment with the United Arab Emirates, so is now gravitating towards a new position inside of the Middle East. And that has been created, that situation has been created directly because of the Iranian support for the Palestinian armed resistance in the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, as well, the Palestinian armed resistance, through its successes in this latest round, has been able to get a lot more wider support from Palestinian citizens inside of the 1948 lines, or what some people will call Israel, inside of the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and unite the people in a way that we've never seen before. So in terms of whether they want more support, I'd say that the Palestinians, from what I can see, all of the organizations across the board that are participating in armed resistance, would be happy with whatever Iran is giving them at this moment. They don't have a condition. They don't support any specific political party inside of Iran or any sort of political leanings. They let Iran do Iran. And as long as it supports the resistance, this is what we hear from their leadership anyway. It seems like they are happy with it.
The Palestinian leadership is now in a total crisis. There are people, thousands of people, demonstrating in Ramallah against the administration of Mahmoud Abbas. Dissidents are being tortured and killed. Mass arrests are taking place. With your ear to the ground, and I don't think this is a digression from the Iranian issue, what's likely to happen in the next weeks and months?
Well, it's a very interesting case. After the assassination of Nizar Banat, who was a very popular, prominent critic of the Palestinian Authority, what we're seeing is that the Palestinian people on the ground in the West Bank are extremely angry with the Palestinian Authority. And really, they're seeing it for what it plays a role as now, and that is a subcontractor for Israel's occupation inside of the West Bank. And so the way the Palestinian Authority operates, essentially, is it controls, as you probably know, the largest population blocks inside of the West Bank, and basically takes the burden off of Israel. And so commits lots of these crimes and atrocities, and continues to do so. Its preventative security services are there, providing Israel with all of its intelligence that's needed. And I suppose how we could relate this back to Iran is the success, perhaps, of the armed resistance and parties as well, like Hamas, for instance, which on the social level would not be supported by all of the Palestinians across, especially in the 48 territories and perhaps all over the West Bank in Ramallah, is now getting a massive amount of support because of the armed resistance, which is something that Iran has committed itself to supporting. But when it comes to the Palestinian Authority, they are against armed resistance. In fact, they are combating Palestinian armed resistance. So it shows that Iran's model of applying pressure through armed resistance is something that works. And we saw this in the case of Lebanon. That's how they expelled the occupying forces. So on the ground in Palestine, it's very much understood by the Palestinian people, from what we can see anyway in terms of public support, that they support armed resistance at this moment as a way of achieving liberation and getting concessions out of the Israeli occupation.
Isa, let's tour the arc, if you like, the arc of influence, more than influence, of Iran at this point in time. As you say, the war in Yemen has gone disastrously badly for the regime in Saudi Arabia. The resistance in Iraq is vibrantly powerful, and by the time this program is seen, may even have done to the American remaining occupiers what the Afghans are now doing to the American empire. They're scuttling like the last days of Saigon. They may do the same in Iraq. Syria has withstood the onslaught of not just the imperialist powers, but all the collaborating Arab powers and extremists from all over the world, including here, including China, and so on. Syria has prevailed against that. And as you said, the resistance in Lebanon has, in one sense, actually never been more powerful, given the weakness of other sectors in the Lebanese polity. That's not a bad report card if you're sitting at the head of the Iranian revolution, is it?
No, absolutely. And, as our colleague here was just saying, at the end of the day, the Iranian, I suppose, approach to the region has always been that try other things, try diplomacy, but armed struggle against, the biggest military in the region, backed by imperialism, is the only way ultimately that you will get results, you will get your liberty and freedom. And it's played out again and again and again in Lebanon, in Yemen. And I think the question of Yemen is really important as well, because we saw, there's a saying, thank God for stupid enemies. The first thing the Americans did when Biden took power was to go after Mohammed bin Salman and literally push him into the hands of the Iranians, because a week after that CIA report came out, he was on TV changing his tune completely and saying, oh, the Iranians play a big role in this region and, they are partners of ours and all of this, because he's feeling the heat as well on his own shoulders as well. So I feel like it's politically as well as militarily that the situation does look promising in many respects for Iran. There are challenges, in Iraq, the American embassy has invested a lot of money and resources in targeting young people, with slogans and propaganda and trying to turn them against the Iranians and the resistance in Iraq itself. And the same.
They're fostering sectarianism.
Yeah, well, actually, it was sectarianism at the beginning. Now they've targeted a lot of, for example, the youth in the Shia areas in the south to more go towards a nationalistic perspective. They're Iranians, you're Arabs, it's different. And it's had some limited success, but it's also backfired as well, because some of these protest movements, for example, just in the past week or so, attacked the electricity grid in Iraq and angered the whole country and turned them against them. So even where the Americans might have some successes, it seems they always overplay their hands, and the Iranian, I suppose, centuries-old tradition of just being patient and letting things play out has actually been successful for them. And just to take it back to President Raisi as well, I'm just as interested as everyone else to see how he will approach the region, because, there are facts on the ground in Iran that the sanctions have harmed ordinary people really badly. There is a desire to trade with the world. Everybody wants to trade, it's a legitimate thing, but at what cost? And a lot of the propaganda when President Raisi won is, he's a hardliner, he was the butcher, he was this, he was that. If they have a problem with it, they have to thank Donald Trump, because it was Donald Trump's decision to kill Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandes that has changed, in my opinion, the Iranian calculation. It's made them decide no more nonsense, no more discussions, no more negotiations with a country which in 4 years will just throw the agreement out. We mean business. And it's because of that kind of buffoonish, arrogant decision-making of the last president that the Americans are going to have these consequences for years to come. And I don't know if America will stick around in the region to really see it out. I think they might, like you said, in Afghanistan, decide it's just not worth it anymore.
Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but discussing Iran and its influence in the region in which it sits. Let's cross to Birmingham in England. A successful Iranian-British businessman and entrepreneur is Dr. Alireza Vossoughi, who has some very pertinent points on the economy in Iran and how that will influence Iran's foreign policy. Welcome, Doctor.
Yes. Hello, George.
As an economist, what's your take on the prospects of a new administration in Iran?
Stagflation started a couple of years ago in Iran, and it is nearing the end of its spectrum. Budget-wise, we have operational deficit of $16 billion, and we have imbalance of 50% in budgets. There are 4 remedies for this purpose. One of them is the political aspect of budget. which is FATF and also JCPOA. And the second one is austerity. The third one is political and technical reform in the structure. And the fourth one is borrowing from banks, printing money, or issuing bonds.
Do you think the new government can finalize the nuclear deal with the US and finally end the sanctions?
Yes, definitely they can reach that. They are trying their best, and they are dealing because, as you know, US withdraw from the JCPOA intentionally because they could not benefit from that JCPOA, I mean, financially. And now, because they have not achieved something, they are trying to get back to return to JCPOA. But because Iran does not trust anymore, they want to have a commitment so USA would not withdraw from the JCPOA in the near future or whenever they think that they do not achieve their financial goals.
Could this be a new factor for economic relations with the West, maybe even with the United States?
You know, both Europe and US are trying to achieve a good share of the Iranian market. EU and US are fighting together to implement their immediate goals in Iran. So because EU have had foreign direct investment in Iran, they can achieve their financial goals easier. So this gives them a good competition over US, and US, the fact that they can sell many things like franchising different kinds of, let's say, supermarkets or products, food products, car manufacturing parts, or even cars, the cars that they can export to Iran, you know, and there is a big competition. And I believe in these meetings in Vienna over JCPOA, the USA is trying to achieve more than what is expected.
Will the reformists have any role in the next government?
I believe they would set back for now and see what is going to happen.
It's a tantalizing prospect, I'm sure. American supermarkets, McDonald's, Burger King opening up across Iran. This is the $64,000 question, isn't it? What is Iran prepared to trade in exchange for the re-entering of the JCPOA and the lifting of the sanctions? What are they prepared to trade internally in terms of foreign investment and trade? What are they prepared to trade externally in terms of their foreign policy?
Well, I think just starting with the external one, we saw even under the so-called, let's say, moderate or reformist government of just previous President Rouhani and Jawad Zarif on many occasions saying that, for example, Iran's ballistic missile program is out of the question because that's a core of their defense strategy. And Iran has been successful at any negotiations keeping these issues off the table. Support for Yemen, Lebanon, a robust national defense system, all of these are without question not even up for debate, because at the end of the day, there's no point having investment in your country if you can't even defend yourselves. And I think they've learnt the lesson from Gaddafi and Saddam and other governments gone who lowered their defense and lowered their guard, paid the price for it. Internally, I think there might be more room for opening up, let's say, the oil and energy sector to foreign investment, and perhaps welcoming that in. But the question, and just listening to, I was fascinated by Ali Reza's words there, how exactly, because all the onus is on the Americans, are they going to build that trust? Because what's to stop Mike Pompeo becoming president in 4 years or 8 years, or another one of these evangelical fanatics ripping the agreement up and going forward? And I think the lesson to be learned here is that these agreements aren't worth the paper that they are written on. America controls the FATF, they control all these international institutions. And
the finance system.
And the finance system. And I feel like, you know, there's been talk of, you know, the Chinese and Russians trying to come up with an alternative to the SWIFT payment system. And And I think that really, while it might sound painful, is opting out of this so-called international system and going one which is more in route with the Belt and Road Initiative and more eastward-looking initiatives. If there are alternative systems that can be built, I think that's really the only way forward, because how can you trust people that tear up their agreements again and again?
But they're not prepared to trade any foreign policies, is what you're saying. I remind you, because you're a young man, but you know about these things. One of the key reasons for the determination to destroy the regime of President Saddam Hussein was his support for the Palestinian resistance. I was in Parliament at the time. It was a constant that he was paying bounties to suicide bombers, and was how they put it. Yet here we have the leader of Hamas on Saudi television thanking Iran for their weapons, all the Palestinian factions receiving weapons from Iran. Are they really not ready to trade that for a restart of their relations with the US?
I believe not, and I believe particularly if it didn't happen under President Rouhani, it definitely won't happen under President Raisi, because the support for Palestine is, of course, a moral one from the Iranian perspective and a political one. It's also a religious one as well. The concept of Quds in, the ideology of the Islamic religion and the Islamic revolution from the time of Imam Khomeini till now has been key. And any, decision to, okay, let's say abandon Quds, let the settlers have it, would just be a betrayal of the basis of the revolution, and I think would be existential to Iran as a country. Support for Palestine, from the Iranian perspective, is a religious obligation as much as anything else. And so for those reasons, I think, and we've seen, with people like Hassan Nasrallah and others who've said, we would even hypothetically make peace with America, but with Israel, it's a red line. Israel is a settler state, it's a Zionist entity. They view it as even being Jewish as well. They've vowed repeatedly to support the building of the oldest synagogues in Lebanon and so on. They say our problem is not with those people.
And of course, there are many Jews still in Iran living a kind of treasure.
Exactly. To make it short, I don't think Palestine, especially, is on the chopping block.
Let's hear from Iran then, from Dr. Hamid Reza Gholamzadeh. He's in Tehran. He is the head of the House of Diplomacy think tank, foreign policy analyst supreme. Let's hear from Dr. Hamid Razi.
Thank you very much for having me, George.
What are the prospects for the new government of Iran?
The most important thing that people are expecting from the next government is to fix the current problems and the situation that we already have in Iran. President Rouhani's administration was accused of inaction, not even misdeeds or wrong actions. In some cases, we were witnessing some inactions, and we can say the only agenda that he had was negotiations with the West and solving every problem, quote unquote, from drinking water to clean air to financial things to economy, and everything was connected to the JCPOA and negotiations with the West in his view. So by putting all the eggs in one basket, he actually failed to fix the problems in the country. So that was the situation that people have been facing for the last 8 years, especially for the last 4 years. The second term, he was actually in power. And now people are expecting that the next government would do something for them, would pay more attention to fixing the economy, actually working for employment or improving production, infrastructures and such things. So it seems that we are going to have some focus on economy internally and domestically, and so it means that actually translates into working to improve production and have something for people to increase employment rates and such things for the people.
How will the Raisi presidency approach the nuclear issue? Will they continue the negotiations with the US, or will they stop them?
For sure, one thing is clear, that the next administration is not investing everything in nuclear deal and nuclear talks. The next administration doesn't seem to be very interested in focusing on foreign policy and paying attention to that, because people are tired with that. People are really exhausted with waiting for foreigners to decide for the situation, and everything can be actually, let's say, we can say unclear unless the negotiations have something for people here inside Iran. So the next administration will focus mainly on domestic issues. And if the Vienna talks is not going to bear any fruit, is not going to have any results, and that is due to the American excessive demands, and that is because they want to keep hundreds of sanctions in place, in that case, it's going to fail. It's actually doomed to failure. And it's not like that the next administration will continue such talks.
How much support will the new government have, given that the election turnout was less than 50% this time around?
When we analyze the turnout, we can realize that those who did not go to the ballot boxes were supporters of Rouhani who voted for him 4 years ago. So majority of people who had voted for a principlist candidate, mainly in the last term, it was again Mr. Raisi. The same people came to the ballot boxes. They turned out again and they voted. But those supporters of reformist camp who voted for Rouhani, they did not appear. And it means that they were dissatisfied with that rhetoric, with that agenda, and with that approach. So there are still people, many people, millions of people who support and invest some hope in a new administration, and they hope that he will fix the situation. As I said, it is a matter of action versus inaction.
Will the reformists have any role at all in the new government?
It seems that Mr. Raisi is going to have some, we can say, bipartisan administration. Of course, we are not expecting that he can have, for example, let's say, an equal share between the two sides, the reformists and the principalists. But it seems that he's going to focus on capabilities and how, let's say, how good people are working. For example, right now we have some vice presidents right now that they are accepted by everyone. Everyone admits that they are doing their jobs very good. Like, for example, scientific deputy. So there are some names, especially when it is about technical positions. But in political positions, he would actually pick his own men. I mean, people from his own side of the politics. But for technical things, like, for example, economy or industry and such things, in those cases, he's not going to work politically, and he will decide, we can say, based on expertise and performance of people.
Fascinating. Robert, I mentioned earlier the U.S. is stealing out of Afghanistan like a thief in the night. It's actually running away from Afghanistan. That poses another problem for Iran, doesn't it? The Taliban are now actually in control of the border crossing into Iran. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, we can presume will be back in power, in powerful positions inside Afghanistan very, very soon, certainly this side of Christmas. Will the United States perhaps use them as a cat's paw against Iran, or will the particular extremism of these organizations in itself be a problem for Iran?
It could be some sort of a security problem for Iran. However, I believe that Iran would have its borders on lock, and that this would impose the biggest threat to them, especially if we're looking at the Taliban right now. It's trying to take over more and more territory, establish its power inside of Afghanistan. And its reach at the moment, I don't believe, without looking into a crystal ball, of course, I don't believe that it would be setting its sights first upon Iran. However, of course, that could present a threat. We don't know what deals have been cut with certain groups, terrorist organizations under under the table with the Biden administration. And the Taliban in general lately, of course, it's engaged with talks with the United States. It's being more strategic than it was in the past. And of course, in the past, we had that history of Iran, running its own military operations against them. But whether they would do something and go on the offensive now is something which is yet to be seen. It's possible. It is plausible that this could pose.
They're still, as the Taliban reminded us, in talks in Doha. I'd like to be a fly on the wall of those talks. If the United States has been defeated in Afghanistan, it will seek to hedge its bets and use the Taliban as they did before, or the fathers of the Taliban against the Soviet Union. They'll seek to use Al-Qaeda and even ISIS as they have done in Syria and other places. What do you think, Ali?
I actually think, I definitely agree that whilst in the past we saw the Taliban perhaps a more aggressive stance with Iran, they killed those diplomats at the end of the 90s, I think things have changed somewhat. I think what we saw, for example, when ISIS were defeated in Iraq and Syria, they somehow magically appeared in Afghanistan. I don't know how they...
You wonder how they get there.
Yeah, you wonder how they get there.
These have their own
these flights. Yeah, they have their own
budget
airline.
flights.
Yeah, exactly. So they were actually fighting the Taliban, and the Taliban were fighting them and defeated them, and actually quite comprehensively. And I think it's, we spoke earlier about some of the sectarian differences. Ironies were that when ISIS moved in and were killing Shia Afghans, those Afghan Hazaras were going to the Taliban and asking them for protection. And I think maybe the Taliban's perspective has matured somewhat because they've been distracted with fighting the Americans. I don't personally foresee them aggressively attacking Iran or becoming like a cat's paw, but I think the problem will be groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, all of these explicitly sectarian groups trying to use Afghanistan as a base. But I think the Taliban, not just because they've made an agreement with the US, but I think it's in their own interests to make sure these groups don't get a foothold, because those groups also are so intolerant, are so extreme, that they even view the Taliban as being heretics and sellouts and
moderates.
So
Patrick, it doesn't sound like you're going to get your wish that Iran is going to go for the nuclear bomb. Listening to the testimony of the Iranian speakers today and our fellow guests, just summarize why you think that the Iranian leadership is on an erroneous course in being prepared to negotiate away its nuclear potential.
Well, if your next door neighbour is a homicidal maniac, then you try and keep your windows and doors locked. Israel is quite capable of dropping a nuclear bomb in Iran if the Americans give the say-so. There's no doubt about that. The only thing that would stop them would be that if there were to be some retaliation of the same sort. That's basically what I'm saying. But I think on the question of Iraq and all the rest of it, if you look at the Americans and Iran and Afghanistan, I don't think really that they were all that interested in Afghanistan in that sense, because when what they were interested in Afghanistan was they saw it as a means to F up the USSR. And when Russia intervened to try and prop up a communist government which didn't really have a mass base, what happened was that the Americans brought in then all kinds of Arab Afghans, so to speak, and others, Osama bin Laden and so on, armed them. And when the Soviets withdrew, and they withdrew in good order, the Americans held on a bit. But the moment that bin Laden did the two towers, they said, this is what we've been waiting for. Now we can, and they said, we'll smash Iraq. That's what they were interested in. They were always interested in smashing Iraq, grabbing Iraq and its oil wealth. And they did it despite the fact that Saddam fought Iran and so on and so forth. They intervened and they got it. Now, I don't think they're going to give it up. I think they'll dig in there. They did run away from Afghanistan, but it was way to put the lights off and run for it. That's what they did. But they weren't really trying to, it wasn't their sphere. That's why they always saw it as a means to bankrupt the USSR. And then, after the Twin Towers, if you read all their stuff from Blair to the Americans, they said immediately it happened, they said, now we'll have Iraq. And Iraq was their objective.
Sure.
They did it. And I think they'll stay there. I don't think they'll leave. There is a lot of very valuable material in Iraq. I think they'll have to be driven out. And I think this is what's going to emerge.
But, Isa, last word to you. It's well within the capability of the Iraqi resistance, and with Iranian support, now more likely rather than not, there'll be no handcuffs on them from the new Iranian president, one presumes. Exactly what happened at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan is going to happen in Iraq, isn't it? I would put money on, if I was allowed to gamble, I would put money on the Americans withdrawing from Iraq, not because they want to, but because it's untenable for them to remain so.
Yeah, and I think that, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, again, the Americans don't do anything out of, moral or the goodness of their hearts. They're restructuring and repivoting towards Africa, and in a wider sense, the battle against China's influence there. If they were to withdraw from Iraq, it would be in the same vein. It would probably be tails between their legs, but some kind of agreement that they leave under the shadow of, a safe exit, if you will. And again, I think it will come down to that. It might be part of an agreement, a wider agreement with Iran, that you guys leave and we won't shoot you on the way out the door, kind of thing. But again, I think going forward, the wider conflict, the American calculation seems to be that China's the big problem, and perhaps we could see them, even the Americans, that is, trying to bring Iran closer to them.
Although Iran has now signed a very important strategic agreement with China, taking Patrick's earlier point forward, it would seem to me obvious statecraft for Iran to get ever closer to China and Russia. Not least because, frankly, President Mike Pompeo, or even President Trump again, coming along in 4 years, is actually a reasonable bet. So a strategic tilt from Iran to the east, if you like, to Russia and to China would be the best form of self-defense, wouldn't it?
I've been saying for the last decade and a half that there should be a counterbalance to NATO, a military alliance between the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and anyone else. And I know there's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which isn't military as such, but I think it should have happened yesterday. And, if somebody like Pompeo or a Trump comes back into power, depending on if, the American system will allow that to happen or not, that's going to be an existential threat to a country like Iran. I think these people are, fanatically motivated against Iran and against China to an extent as well. So I think, they should be closer to them, and I think there should be military treaties in place. Attack one is an attack on all.
Now, it's far from crazy what Patrick's saying, because, China would never negotiate away its nuclear weapons, neither would Russia. So by Iran negotiating away its chance of having nuclear weapons, it will need to be under an umbrella held by people who do have nuclear weapons. A quick roundup.
They're always questionable, aren't they?
Yeah, a quick roundup. Report card time. How would you score Iran's position in the region, in the world now? Marks out of 10.
Well, it's still there, so I give it 7 for still being there, despite all the opposition and all the rest of it. The attempts internally to create...
More than 40 years.
That's right.
And they've never flinched. In fact, they're the only force on earth that has never flinched in more than 40 years. Their anti-imperialism today is precisely what it was in 1979.
Right.
You're giving them 7. What are you giving them? Hard to follow that. Yeah, I'll give them about an 8. I'd say, you look at Lebanon. They've had sanctions for about a year and a half, and the country's pretty much collapsed. And yet Iran have had worse than 40 years, and still, despite the problems, despite everything internally, the country functions. People have a relatively good standard of life, and externally as well, they remain very influential. So, all things considered, mate.
And Robert, where are you going?
I'd say if we're looking at how they've expanded in the region, their influence, what they've done.
Yeah, not their internal politics.
Yeah,
I'd have to score them lower than 7 on
but
that.
if we're looking at that, I mean, they helped liberate South Lebanon, and now the Lebanese people at least have liberation. Of course, there's a crisis ongoing there. They've helped the Palestinian resistance, and they've always stood by them. They stepped in to help the Syrian government from collapsing. Of course, they filled a void there in Iraq as well and helped the defeat of Daesh in the country. And then we look at their aiding of Ansar Allah inside of Yemen. So if we're looking at the region, you have to give them a very high score. You have to give them at least an 8 or a 7 or maybe even a 10 out of a 10 for what they have done in the region and how significant that is. Because it's not just them resisting imperialism, it's every single other country which they're involved in, and they have backed them to the hilt. They have really helped them liberate their territories and keep it free of this foreign hegemony, the U.S. hegemony in the region. They've helped expel U.S. forces and their allies actively like no other has ever done. So you'd have to rank them very highly for that.
I was actually going to make that speech, but you made it better than me. The torch has passed to a new generation. I give them 10 out of 10 for the success of their external political line. And those who gave them lower marks are probably now regretting it. I've been George Galloway. You have been a marvellous audience. Thanks for watching كلمة on Al Mayadeen television.